to everyone for the last session of the symposium. It's a pleasure to welcome back our speakers, this time as panelists. So we'll have a chance to interact and ask questions and quiz them on the topics of their talks, but more generally on the sort of social aspects of automation. I think we have, okay, everyone will get the chance here to ask questions. Also, the remote audience can interact through the chat, and we'll be monitoring that for questions. And just to get us started, I can start, I guess, by asking the panel one or maybe two questions, and then we can open the floor for discussion. And one thing that occurred to me during the afternoon through the talks was that we may be facing a very difficult task here. I mean, Sarah hinted at this in her talk that, we somehow need to define, what we mean by fairness and this sort of question. And already next talk, Andrea comes up and has 3 different definitions of fairness, and then more to come, because in his closing slides, he said that's only the beginning, you can keep going with this, right? And my question was more, is there any hope of even doing this? So when we look at sort of the ethical questions of automation, for example, and we're trying to somehow codify in our designs through our cost functions and constraints or whatever, something that's implicit in all of us, that's evolved over generations. And some, in my feelings, that's probably not even consensus. Before we even get to cultural factor, if we look among us and we ask, what would be the right thing to do in a situation like this, we get a big variance. So is there any hope of ever doing that? Is there any hope of, in the technical systems that we're developing, which are very deterministic, not in the sense of, there's not uncertainty, but you put the rules down and you put it in, implicitly in a cost function or explicitly in a design, is there hope of actually codifying these very fluid questions that, we face here?
Yeah, I can say some things. Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think even as early as maybe 2018 or something, I think Arvind Narayanan had I don't remember if it was a paper or a tutorial he gave that was like the 12 definitions of machine learning fairness or something like this, where, there's many ways to define fairness. And, once you have a definition, you can make algorithms for it. And then you can think of a new tweak to the definition, and that's hard. And so you make a new algorithm, and right, there's a lot of kind of interesting technical work to do, but then suddenly there's just like 12 definitions of fairness. And then there's like this gap between any system that's deployed, maybe with 0 fairness, and then the question of what type of fair system, like what type of fairness do you actually want in a system? So I think it's a very relevant question. And my take is that for specific systems with clear goals, it's possible to come up with approaches that are better than doing nothing, but that it's not a great idea to treat the approach as the end-all be-all. Like, we solved it technically, it's optimal, and so we never have to come back and revisit it. Instead, it should be like, and here's the way we communicate that to the public or to policymakers, and now it's like an open document that we could come back and revise if it turns out we wanted to do something different after all.
Yeah, no, I would echo that as well. Definitions serve a purpose. I mean, definitions need to be useful, and so definitions necessarily are contextual. I mean, I think the notion of fairness in the context of a power grid, where the end goal is to deliver electricity reliably, is very different from having fairness in, say, for instance, in the context of transportation, which is the right of access to a road in a reliable manner. I think the two invoke 2 different sets of needs and requirements, and I think that in turn will precipitate what would be the fairness aspect, I think, in those sectors. But yeah, within a context, I think it makes a lot of sense to really iron it out, especially as the cyber footprint in those sectors increase.
And I was just going to add, I mean, we discussed this at the retreat in June as well, to some extent, about designing what we see as the ethical optimal solution according to our notion of fairness. But I think, and maybe road testing different models with the public based on different definitions of fairness. So road testing is not an intentional pun. is the way that's going to go. And Andrea just, before we were starting there, asked about politics versus ethics, because you can have the best, if the most efficient system, the most ethical system, even if the public are on board with it, it's ultimately going to have to be politically acceptable as well. So I think, but I mean, if we have enough time and processing power to do it, to just run lots of different models with different types of fairness, and like Andrea was getting into the different types, equal opportunity, reparation, and so on, and plugging all of those in, and then seeing which are most acceptable. And I think ultimately, engineers might have to compromise on efficiency, and philosophers might have to compromise on ethics to get something that actually works out there.
That's it.
I think that these socio-technical systems are very complex. So I would be thinking that it would be reasonable to have, instead of a scalar performance index, to have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. I think certainly there are different kinds of fairness, and the way I think about it is that so it is not the duty of the engineer to actually come up with the ethical choices. I think it's the duty of the engineer to explain what our systems can do. I mean, these are the options, and then somebody else can make the choice. So in that sense, you want to have enough performance indices so that any society, maybe any country, can make their own choices. You know, maybe the reparation dimension is not important here in Europe. Here in Europe, we want to have the perfect society, the asymptote we are, right? It's more important in different countries. As an engineer, like, you want to serve both countries. You want to say, well, this is our index, this is our index. So maybe this algorithm gets this scorecard, this is another scorecard, and you decide.
So basically your answer is pass the buck.
Yes. You know, I think this is very important. Like,
but at the end of the day, someone has to make a decision there, right?
But not me, not the engineer, not the science, not well, maybe
I can take this one. I'll make the decision.
But I think it's very important, because I see actually a lot of, you know, if I can make a critique, when I see, for example, machine learning, lots of discussion about biases, but I think scientists sometimes overextend, right? Because when they start saying, okay, but this is what you should do, it starts to be politics, and you can check it. If you can take a statement, if the statement is true in every country at any time, then it's science. But otherwise, it's something else. I also think that it's fine for scientists to do politics, or, you know, to contribute to public discussions, right? But you can have to separate at different times.
So, I mean, yeah, I agree. I don't think Andreas is saying is passing the buck, because it's a problem that we all have to jointly solve. Even if we come with definitions of fairness, and let's say that there is more than 1 and 4 or 5, then that has to be implemented. And for implementation, you need to work with policymakers and regulators. Then once you implement it, you have to address what happens when somebody breaks it. So then I think there needs to be accountability. There needs to be different levels of penalty. Lawyers get involved. I mean, and then I think there is a question of sort of whatever, some sort of a pushback from the community. Then I think political leaders probably will have to make. I think it has the various components, and so once we analyze the system and we come up with what the systemic effects are of one or more definitions of fairness, I think then others have to join the conversation and figure out what the chain of sequence of events is that would follow from any of those kinds of technical quantified metrics. And I think we have to propose that. And for that, I think we are coming to the table to join the conversation with other experts.
Yeah, and actually, I could add like a maybe concrete example of this, where I think the role of like the technical definition is clarification rather than prescription. So I think there's a kind of a famous machine learning bias example was a ProPublica investigation of the COMPAS algorithm, which was a recidivism prediction algorithm that was kind of meant to say, is this a high or low risk defendant? And that was meant to be used by a judge to decide whether this person should be released on bail or kept in pretrial detention, which is like clearly itself as a setting, there's a lot going on ethically. But the ProPublica investigation used this algorithm and used its true and false positive error rates and the disparity between those across race, so for white and Black defendants, as a way to like kind of criticize it. And the response by the company was to say, well, actually conditioned on the score the algorithm gives a defendant, there's approximately equal outcomes by race, which somehow sounds like that's the same thing as true and false positive, but the difference is one you condition on the prediction and the other one you condition on the outcome, right? So you're kind of just flipping the probability fractions. And so that's, that's the first, just formalizing that is one way to explain the difference. And then the next step is there's some theory actually by John Kleinberg, a professor at Cornell in my department, that says actually you can't satisfy these two, different forms of error rates at the same time in general. And so, there shouldn't be a debate about like who's right. Both people are right. And the fact that this error rate is satisfied means this one can't be. And so if it's unacceptable that the false positive rates are unequal, this system shouldn't be used the way it is. But it's not a defense to offer up a different rate being equal, because actually it's totally consistent that those two things can happen.
I have lots more questions, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So I'd like to invite the audience to offer any thoughts.
I want to ask about putting privacy and fairness together. So when I think about it, to me, privacy and fairness are both kind of being not blind, but robust to some properties of the data. Like you don't want the accuracy to be robust to like the race of the participants. So for me, fairness and privacy are kind of the same. But then when I look at the solutions that were suggested, like having multiple learners or having an additional variable, the karma, it looks to me as if you want to improve fairness, you should kind of compromise privacy. Like if you have multiple learners and you're using different learners for each person, then you're maybe revealing some additional aspects of your data. So I would like to ask, what do you think about these? Like, are these two definitions or two concepts contradicting, or can they be improved simultaneously?
If I'll just go first, because I know least about it, so it's best that I get out of the way. But there's trade-off not only with fairness and privacy, but also efficiency potentially. So as a naive philosopher, just looking at crash scenarios, I was saying, obviously it would be better if cars communicated about what they're going to do in this scenario so they can like make decisions together in that scenario. But then you run straight into car manufacturers don't want to share proprietary data, and there's concerns about cyber attacks between if cars start coordinating and hacking. So in situations like that. So that means you might have a trade-off in efficiency. And in terms of fairness, obviously, I mean, total science fiction scenario, you could imagine people walking about and their Apple Watch says, always save children before me, or something like that. And that's fine to broadcast that. But you can make better decisions if everyone's totally transparent about everything. But it's not clear that everyone wants to trust. And also Andrea spoke about that in terms of the kind of karma models. Everyone believes that the central coordinating intelligence has their best interests at heart. So there could be trade-off between privacy and efficiency and all of those different factors, I think.
Yeah, I can say something about kind of fairness in the context of machine learning, where like, let's say you have different groups, different genders or different races or combinations thereof, and you want to, and the idea of fairness is about equality between those groups in some metric. Then in general, without knowing those groups, it's hard to say anything about fairness. Even like, this is also a problem even in auditing, for example, where like, even if you want to see if the system is working well, if you don't have this information, you really can't say anything about it. And so there is some tension there. But in actually the work I talked about, even though, so if you look at the resulting configuration, that would reveal, let's say, the group of a user. It's not something that's explicitly used by the learner. So in this case, kind of that aspect is potentially still private, unless of course the learning algorithms are saving, who exactly is using my algorithm. And now I'm, going to infer something about that with respect to my competitor, for example, which probably they are doing. But But I'll say that actually, so the work we were inspired by in the single learner setting actually did propose kind of just a robust optimization method as a way to ameliorate the effect of one population completely leaving a service when you don't think about the alternatives. And so there, you're not robust over known groups because you may not know what group users are in. You do a distribution and robustness to all subgroups of a certain size, and they kind of show in that paper that works for these dynamics. And so there are approaches that are kind of agnostic to groups. But I guess, sorry, they are conservative. That's the downside, right? Then you have to assume that every subset of your population could be a protected group, and therefore you have to act much more conservatively, which gives you then an accuracy trade-off, which kind of like an efficiency trade-off. Sorry.
I wanted to skip it this, but I guess
I was pointing at that actually because
I can
Okay, I'll say something. I think that so when you say privacy, I hear trust, right? In the sense that so that there are two different ways to interpret it. One is that you don't want to reveal your personal status to the service you interact with, or whether you are happy to reveal it. I'm happy that my Apple Watch knows my bio data, but I don't want them to reveal it further. So I need to trust them that they need to, keep the data secure. Yeah, so I think it's just another dimension of the, on the scorecard. Like the more you share, the better the service will be. Yeah, so I understand the concern.
Yeah, no, I mean, at some level, I agree that there is a tension between privacy and fairness. I mean, it certainly happens in the context of a power grid. So let's say that we are considering a scenario where there is a lot of renewables and a lot of rooftop solars and a lot of demand response, and they're all contributing to this 100% deep decarbonized township and country and so on. So then you have, under normal circumstances, then you want to be able to inject power into the grid, and everybody gets this green electron, and we're all good. But suppose there is an outage, and then there is a widespread outage, and you have like a monsoon that you had 2 days ago, followed by a cyber attack, and everybody's down, and it really is. In that scenario, you do need to forego a certain amount of privacy, or maybe all of your privacy, in order to really perhaps shorten the time to recovery, and because you're donating all of your IoT networks in order to. So, you can consider so many different scenarios, and we really have to learn from the social scientists to figure out how efficiently you can construct these scenarios so that you really do the minimal amount of sacrifice of service for the maximum amount of resilience. So I think there are all these sort of very nuanced trade-offs that I think we will have to address as we design more and more cyber-physical human systems that are socially responsible.
We have a question online, so maybe we switch to that and come back to the audience in a moment. Actually, it's addressed more to Andrea, but I think it's of relevance to the rest of the panel as well. It's from Stephen Milford, who starts, I loved Andrea's presentation, and the idea of karma credits and trading. And the question is, can I ask, how would you avoid the situation in which someone needs priority, e.g., for example, they need to go first for a medical reason, but they have no karma points. So he continues, the problem is life's not fair, and sometimes you find yourself in need, but you don't have the resources or the karma points in this case to save yourself. So how would this be addressed in a karma setting, but also more, I guess, more generally for society, right?
Okay, so in the karma system, I must reply by, we should have thought about that. You should have had, you should have built up always have enough karma to drive to the hospital. I think what's interesting is whether, so actually we always thought in the float, at least in terms of, a single car with an occupant, right? But then you can think about how society, there's another level where you say, well, you're a doctor doing home visits, or you're an ambulance, right? So in that case, there might be another way to get karma, maybe temporary karma that's going to expire, so that you can get to your destination faster.
I have nothing to add.
Okay.
But I have a different question, but we can come back to that later. Everybody else is done.
Maybe
Yes, I want to connect a bit to the question we discussed about fairness and so. When resources try to be fair, do you see a risk that it can get too political in the sense that I have my political bias that I'm maybe conscious or unconscious with, and that we get too much politics into the science? If so, how can we avoid it?
I think that's an interesting point. And just generally, there's a kind of asymmetry there. If people talk about, I mean, for example, is a capitalistic model the right model for developing autonomous systems for society? People think you're like Jeremy Corbyn, a crazy communist person, for doing that. So bringing that kind of politics in isn't right. But of course, it's political to have a capitalist system in any case. So there's a kind of status quo bias there. So I think you're right about research. I think someone at the retreat mentioned. This thing about there was a researcher who'd been coding or something for fairness, but it was entirely their own notion of fairness according to them. So, but I think that's not really. So there's a political aspect, but for me, I would call that just people bringing their own morality into things. Whereas what we should have is some type of ethical framework. And like I liked Andrea's point earlier about most of you with PhDs are in fact doctors of philosophy, even if you don't do philosophy. But I think that's a useful distinction to bear in mind. So politics is what's politically acceptable. People have their own intuitive morality, even if it's well considered. But ethics tries to be the science of morality. And I think that's how you should approach these issues within what we're interested in doing. But of course, there's bias and conflicts of interest everywhere, but we just have to try our best to be transparent about what values we're bringing to the conversation.
I already studied my stance on that. I think that when I'm, with my affiliation of ETH Zurich, right? So I need to talk about science, right? And science is what is translation invariant. It's true wherever you are, right? But I do think, of course, that good academicians should also have a political stance as well, right? Academia is where ideas grow and we discuss. It's just that we need to distinguish, like we can do half an hour of science and then we switch to the politics, but we shouldn't mix the two. Like in my talk, I talk about the social credit system. Try to be as objective as possible. That works with some assumptions, and it is where we should stay. We should stick with that when we talk as scientists. And then the next half an hour we can go and protest whatever we want.
I guess I would say I've read too many philosophy of science books to like know if I can say anything at all that's objective. I think like in some sense the best you can do is just try to add clarity and push that as far as possible. And also I thought actually I really liked like the karma talk. I thought that was a very clear way of laying out like, under what assumptions, like what do we mean when we say this? And I think that does help. But in some sense, I also do believe that if you try to say it's not political, then maybe you're just forgetting that there is this political thing that actually underlies the way you've scoped the problem already. And whether that matters or not depends, I think, on kind of the context of the system you're building. So I think a lot of machine learning research and a lot of the fairness in machine learning work is driven by being critical of the current paradigm of like extremely data hungry large companies that are using automation for purposes that like to do things that maybe people don't necessarily even agree should be automated. And so fairness is a way to criticize the system, but I actually think some of the fairness stuff is a political way to say the system is not actually a valid system for society.
Yeah, I agree with Andrea's point. I mean, I think as control engineers, our task here is to be axiomatic in our approach. I think laying out clearly what the assumptions are that we're making, and under these assumptions, these are the definitions of fairness that is appropriate for this context. So I think those qualifications, those caveats are important in order to really put forth unambiguous paradigms, which I think is what we're in the business of. And that's a starting point. And hopefully with time, with that clarity, we will move towards not just a set of analysis tools, but towards a prescriptive tools, which I think we do want to go towards. But it's a long process and has to be done carefully.
I think Roy had the...
Yeah, I just, I mean, there's a question of the sort of morality, of personal morality coming in, but I see sort of larger potential polluting factors in this, and you mentioned politics as one. But even in the karma system, I'd see the existence of money gives you a back channel to almost any system you're going to create. So I could force an employee of mine to essentially always give way to me on the road, and I might reward them with actual money because they're rewarding me with karma points, which I have a lot of. And so there's a potential there, and also I guess in the games and not games, but the recommender systems and things like that, I can see it being exploited for commercial purposes more than any other fairness objectives. So how do you try and minimize that part or that aspect?
I think that
Just,
would be
just to repeat the question for the online audience, I'm not sure if it's audible to everyone, but I'll just very briefly summarize, if I may. The question is, mixing money with other mechanisms, I guess, right? So if there is a financial back channel that you can use to compromise karma or other fairness type notions.
Yes, I think that's another design requirement, or at least another evaluation dimension. So what's difficult is that to really talk about whether you cannot pollute the system with karma, you need to move, sorry, with money, yes. You need to think about a specific instantiation. What we showed was, this ideal case of, cars and intersections, but the other case. So it's hard to say, right? Because it's unless you spell down the rules. So I think it's a design requirement for any deployment of the theory.
Just follow up. Thanks. That question helped crystallize something I was wondering about. Andrea's talk about the karma. But if I was thinking about time, you said there's 4 issues with money, and I was thinking of the 5th, which I don't think you mentioned, which is that some people have to spend a lot more time to earn the same amount of money as other people as well. And then thinking of that in the context of karma, if you've got lots of leisure time, say you've won the lottery or you acquired your wealth in some more questionable way, you can spend your days driving about being nice to people and getting loads of karma, which puts you at an advantage over people who are working 2 jobs, 9 to 5, and they're always driving in the rush hour, and they're going to lose their job if they're late. Is that type of, it's just because, that's just the nature of society. So, even if the karma system itself internally seems pretty good, despite this problem about people having access to money, being able to game the system. But quite apart from whether people can afford the karma system on their car, which is another question, it just seems like time and the leisure time that people have gives them a resource with which they could game the karma system potentially.
Yeah.
So can I pile on one more thing?
Great. Everyone picks on one panel.
So since I've come originally from India, where karma was originally defined, there is a time scale issue.
Mm-hmm.
Because the notion of karma is that you build a lot of karma, and so in your next life you do something better. So that's a time scale. So what if all the karma that you're building, which is sort of related to the point that you're making, you're not able to recoup the benefits in this life, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So then at some point, then that starts to introduce some unfairness, maybe, because you don't even know when you're going to recoup that. And the theory of karma says it could be in your next life. For example, I'm just deliberately piling on you.
Yeah. So actually, I didn't. We use karma as a keyword, so we don't. I didn't even talk about the real thing.
No,
but I think that's what the discount factor is for, right? Where essentially, in a transaction, where discount factor basically is provided you're going to die, right? So it depends. So you just take your life expectancy and you take the logarithm, you get you get your discount factor.
But I think it also certainly brings up.
So I think there, and this is similar to the question of Roy, right? Which is is there a meta game? So can I game the game? I think in this case the assumption is that nobody likes to be on the road more than necessary. But for different, if it was a different instantiation, different systems, maybe could have been different. So I don't doubt that when we look at more particular instantiations, then we come up with different problems to address or considerations.
Yeah.
So looking forward to do that.
Yeah, no. Another thing I think that's just another example of like, yeah, just thinking of counterexamples and posing problems and then mapping out all the implications of those and anticipating them and designing the system around that. Really, yeah.
Everyone is speaking on Andrea, and the online audience is no exception. So there is one more question, which actually opens yet another window, I guess, to this question of monetizing karma, which is from an anonymous attendee. Is it also possible to donate karma for the purpose of altruism?
Wow.
All right. Cool.
Wow. That's an interesting idea.
It's a virtual karma.
So what we are thinking for now is the ability to pool karma, which means that if we are both in the same car, somehow, we should act as one. So we could choose to, so we split the car. You have, but the donation thing, I don't think you want to allow it, because you cannot make sure that it's not there's not financial back channel.
Yeah, I was thinking that
That's
would
a
open a
trick
very
question.
obvious
It's a
financial
trick question,
background,
yes.
yeah.
Is it just a side issue in that? When I was watching your presentation, you spoke about people are acting entirely altruistically. I think you said at one point.
It looks
It looks like they are. Yeah, okay, right. So it looks like they are. No, because that's what I was thinking, because karma makes it sound nice and so on. But of course, most people will comply with the system because of the efficiency rather than the kind of altruistic.
Yeah,
aspect.
that's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah, yeah. Sure.
Because you have all these self-interest agents that
Yeah.
somehow act as if they were.
Yeah.
And altruistic is in our mind, right? It's not a quantity that you can measure.
No.
It looks like, and if it looks like, it's good enough, right?
Yeah.
But is it true? Is it clear that there are no benefits to donating karma? Because you could have, at some level, does it not contribute to making things more equitable? Because you might have a scenario where, you are in a bind and you are running, I don't know, you have 2 jobs, and so you always have to go during rush hour and come back, and so your back is to the wall, and so it would be nice to have some sort of a community bank of karma and then draw from that. So then you are able to, because you're in need. So is there scenarios like that? Where,
I think so. If you can avoid the contamination of karma by other wealth that's unfair.
Yeah.
But so yes, in the ideal case, yes, you could have family karma battle, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's like you share your ownership of things with your wife or partner, right?
It's like Netflix password.
But it would make sense, because it's called the karma system, but it sounds, what you're talking about actually sounds more like karma, because like you need it, so you take it. People can donate, and then when you're better off, you can pay back into the system. So that does sound. So having a karma system that actively forbade that would seem. But I can see there would be trade-offs, but it would be nice if it were possible.
May I add to that point?
Yes, please.
That's something I reflected on. So far, all the karma systems or the protocols that were shown, we do something like a uniform redistribution of karma. The redistribution itself is a big design degree of freedom. So if as a society we agree that there are some vulnerable people who deserve more karma because so you can do an equity versus equality kind of thing, and we're just providing the tools to do that.
And as we go more and more in that direction, at some point, isn't it like money? Because it's like loans, and then maybe
Karma welfare.
Yeah.
It's this isolation. But here's the thing: that it's all about this isolation. That you can only exchange it in this particular way while actually acting in the system. And if you violate that, then all the properties are lost.
Good point.
Yep.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk. So as robotics and controls engineers, we are really interested into accelerating electrical mobility and making autonomous vehicles the norm, right? As far as transportation goes. And from the technical challenges and even from the safety challenges, right? We have been able to make a lot of progress by, let's say, integrating safety notions into reinforcement learning algorithms, control systems like multiple control, path planning. So my question is, when we consider fairness, right, how can we sort of integrate fairness into these algorithms and these systems? And also considering that fairness has to be somehow legislated, right? And that legislation changes from place to place and time to time. So what would be some ways to kind of integrate it into our algorithms and systems to accelerate?
Maybe I'll repeat the question for the online audience. So the question is, what is the best way to integrate fairness into technical systems, also in the context of the legal question, which is, which changes from time to time. So
that's the next round of funding from NCC. I mean, it's a very tough question to answer. And again, knowing very little about, let me go ahead and start, hand it over to the experts. I think it's something that we need to chip away at very, very carefully. And I think it is extremely scenario dependent. I think there are various permutations and combinations that I think we need to think through. Combination of mixed autonomy, some cars that are manually driven and some that, etc. And then I think all kinds of different combinations, because it's not just a point. It's not just a matter of definition of fairness, it's everything that comes after that, right, in terms of accountability and mitigation and so on. I don't have any answers, but I just know that it's a very difficult question that we need to proceed systematically like we do in any of our technical problems.
No, I mean, I don't have a technically satisfactory answer to that, but I think, the hierarchy I spoke about is trying to be fair. And it's very crude. And as I said, you still have to get into trade-offs with utility and responsibility potentially as well. But, and I don't know systems engineering and so on, but it seems like probably it's going to be about setting different priorities for algorithms. And depending on the specific scenario, those priorities might reorder. But that gets back to that issue of like the school bus is easy, the single pedestrian is easy, and it's what the algorithms will do and how the priorities will shift at the mid-range that is really the difficult question. And I think an answer to your question, you don't tell it to be fair, you set the priorities, run it, and see whether our consensus is that what it's doing, the decisions that are being made in those scenarios are actually fair, according to whatever criteria for fairness we're using.
Yeah, and I think even those priorities may be event triggered or time triggered.
Yeah, but like following up on that, wouldn't that be very, very difficult to kind of generalize and scale, considering that, like, even today in many places of the world, we have autonomous vehicles running in the streets, right? So eventually, these moral or fairness notions, they have to be integrated, right? If we want to keep continuing.
Sure, but I guess it's 2 problems with that. I mean, they have to be integrated within each jurisdiction, and I think ethics should come before law. Although obviously it's tempting because the law dictates the behaviour. And obviously, you might have. If you're driving across Europe in 20 years in an autonomous vehicle, good luck, because its behaviour, well, maybe not in the EU, but it could change as you cross each border. So I assume you don't mean international integration of one. Because even if we within the NCCR are able to agree on our definition of fairness, people, we don't want different cantons to have different definitions of fairness. Imagine the chaos coming down over the Alpine passes. Yeah, no, you're quite right. But I can imagine, like, you could have names for the different hierarchies or the different ordering of priorities, and each of those would be a different system. That could be applied, and you could say, okay, well, in this context of downtown Johannesburg, we're going to apply this, and also because of the local driving behaviours, if there's still people on the roads at that point, and of course there'll be trade-offs also, because you might have especially in a hybrid situation where you've got drivers and non-human drivers, you could have the best, fair, most equitable solution for the AVs, but then it runs into humans acting human, and it just fails entirely. So I think and I don't know whether that's possible, but just having all of these different solutions on the shelf and finding, and each of those would still have to be adaptable to different contexts and different scenarios. and having those different solutions for different jurisdictions and so on. But it does come into that problem again of I actually think that in most cases you can look back, at least in clinical ethics and in science and ethics, and say we shouldn't have done that, we should have done this. I think that will also be true looking backwards at different fairness scenarios on the road and in electricity distribution. I'm not sure. Sometimes there will still be some room for disagreement. But I actually disagree with Andrea in the sense that I think ethics is true everywhere. It's just difficult to know beforehand. And we learn more and improve systems by looking back at the ethical decisions that were made. But then, of course, there's always, well, for many centuries, there'll still be an element of different cultural moralities that will, because there's still some countries that women can't drive in. So there's still lots of work to be done there, obviously.
I worked for some time in self-driving car industry, and for a startup called Newtonomy from MIT, now it's called Motional. And actually my job was exactly to describe that those priorities, that ordered list of priorities. And essentially what we did was exactly try to be formal about all the things that you could describe. Basically have a library, let's say, of cost functions. Okay. And then we had a system that was flexible enough that you could define any partial order of rules, and the system would choose the best ones according to the behavior that would maximize that partial order error function, right? And yeah, we were deploying both in Singapore as well as the US, and essentially we did have different rule books. Rule books was the technical name we used for that, for Singapore and the US. Actually, the best example we had was that the US team actually had a rule said, we detect animals as a class in machine learning. There's persons, there's sports, and there's animals. In the US, they tell you, well, when there's a deer on the road, you should not swear, you should just eat it. That's the safest thing to do, right? Then, of course, cows were the same as deer in our system. And now the same rule in India would not be, and that was actually the example I used to motivate, the development of this. If you Google my name plus rule books, you will see that actually we managed to publish a couple of papers on that. So you can see actually how we did it. But yeah, the official position of the company was also the same as was my position, which was that we would not say we would choose the ethical priorities for the car, but we would be explainable. Actually, we would not just after the fact, but so this is our priority, and then the regulator in each country will tell us that's a good choice or not, and we'll be free to change because the system was flexible.
Something I would add is a lot of these conversations are predicated on the ability of systems to recognize deer and cows and things like this. And even in the context of fairness, in facial recognition, for example, many of the problems with these systems actually precede fairness and are maybe illustrated well by fairness. I think, for example, in coded bias, Joy Buolamwemi did a great audit study of how bad facial, I think it was gender recognition, and she curated a data set of faces, I think from actually UN members or politicians from all over the world, which was then kind of more racially balanced than a lot of existing facial recognition data sets, and use that to show that the system really underperformed on dark-skinned female faces. And you could say that's a fairness problem, but another way of framing it is it's a the system doesn't work problem. And so I think a lot of the issues of quote unquote fairness in automated systems, especially those involving computer vision and deep neural networks, which are not quite explainable and also not very robust still, and maybe never will be, is do they really work? And if they worked, actually, we don't really care about fairness, right? If you can just detect gender of a face, at 100% for everybody, then there's no question maybe about why there needs to be a bias or fairness issue. And it only comes up because the system performs so poorly in some metric. And so I guess like I want to credit like Deb Raji, who's a PhD student at Berkeley, who does a lot of auditing work, who has experience with a lot of systems that say, oh, audit this for bias. And then she comes back and says, your predictions don't make sense. Like you're using this to make decisions on people's lives. Like your predictions have like a 60% accuracy. Like that's pretty bad, right? And so I think actually like as, you know, control and automation engineers, there's actually just a role in improving the technical reliability of a system that goes a long way.
I do have a question, which is the following. I think that in all the examples that we have seen today, we have this interaction with humans, right? And if we want to prove anything about the system, we need to assume a model of the human behavior somehow, right? So where are we out there? Do you think that the models that we have are satisfactory, or improvement is needed? So that's the weak point of any analysis, or we should, you know, cooperate with other science people, psychology, for instance, or other disciplines in order to improve the models of humans that we have.
So maybe I'll repeat the question.
Yeah.
The question is about, because all these systems are now interacting with humans, as Anu was saying in her talk, either as the plant or the controller or both. In principle, you need models for the humans, and the question is, where are we with models for the humans, and how can we get models for the humans by interacting with other
I think
disciplines?
we're just starting. I think that we really have a long way to go. But it's also because it's not just, yes, of course, we should work with behavioral dynamicists, behavioral psychologists, and whatever the context is that on which the human modeling behavior is predicated. I mean, not even behavior, human model is predicated. I think in the context of urban mobility, in the context of making decisions, it's the utility theory, right? What is it that provides value? But in another context, it might be something else. So it really, I think, very much depends on, so the LMI modeling, for instance, in the context of energy justice, and that is a subfield where there's some growing body of work. That's very different from what would happen. I mean, you know, our value functions vary so much depending upon context. So I think there's that thing that I didn't really get into in my talk. There is this whole notion of prospect theory that's been proposed again by behavioral dynamicists, you know, Kahneman and Tversky, where there's all kinds of inbuilt notions of irrationality, perceived risk, distortion of probability, distortion of value function. Those are all, again, things that body of work that's out there proposed by behavioral dynamicists, which I think we should learn from. But exactly how you marry those models to the infrastructure, you know, to the actual physical problem within which the human is either, you know, is embedded, I think and those are all things that I think fall completely within our purview. And we have to figure out what that interface is and make sure that as a whole it makes sense, because we're trying to not just model the human, we are trying to model the overall socio-technical system, which I think comes in different shapes and sizes. So I think there's a lot to be done, and I think it's a very rich area where we do need different kinds of expertises to be in the same room.
No, I completely agree. And just a more specific one, just as an ethicist, I mean, all this behavioral data is really important, but it tells us how people act. And sometimes I wish that we could also have models for how people ought to act. And not because of the system we're designing, but like, you know, if we assume that people were educated better and understood the implications of their decisions better, which people just generally in all areas of life, they're not good at mapping or using, we talk about their moral imagination. So like you'll help the beggar in the street, but you don't think about the 1,000 starving in Africa, things like that. So I think, I mean, I'm not familiar with all the models, but they're all lots of behavioral data and psychology data is based on just how people react on the road. And it would be nice to also, I mean, obviously you have to plan for the way people actually act in real life, but I think it would be also nice to have models for people acting better. So maybe not angels driving cars, but if it was hoping for a better standard of behavior from people and devising models for that as well. So maybe not in smart cars, but just generally in autonomous systems.
So in that spectrum, is it also reasonable to ask for the worst case model? I mean,
yeah,
this is the worst thing that the human can do to bring the whole thing down or something. And then you make sure that you never hit that.
But I thought that we have the data on that. That's just how people act.
I have a funny story. So it's even more complicated than that, because not only humans machine interact, but they both learn from each other, right? With self-driving cars, you have pedestrians. So the car is trying to learn how pedestrians behave. The pedestrian has a new self-driving car. Imagine like flashing lights. I'm a self-driving car, right? How does it act, right? And the problem that we encountered in our deployment in Singapore was that we programmed the car to be very conservative, okay? Because of safety, right? You see somebody, you stop, right? And then what the people learn is that, okay, this car is always going to stop, right? So let me try, how can I be the most risky and the car still stops, right? And so you have this strange feedback loop, right? In some sense, it's similar to, the recommender system learning, right? And so in a sense, actually, you should also have in your cost function a term which is, are you teaching the human the right thing?
Yeah.
Right.
I totally agree with that, actually. And I think like you can do all this behavioral modeling and say, what I want is to predict human behavior, which is, will they click on the next thing I show them? But like somehow it's not necessarily a virtuous cycle. And eventually it catches up to you where people are like, okay, I'm quitting Facebook. Like, I can't stand this anymore, right? And so I think like there's like the difference between maybe a human and like a physical plant, right? Like a plant modeling physical dynamics, is that the physical dynamics aren't strategic. They don't have their own moral choices. They also, aren't like humans can decide how to act. Like you could encourage humans to trust you and therefore to give you richer forms of feedback about what they like, for example. But in order to get that, you would need, to design systems differently. You wouldn't just want to track clicks. You would want to somehow have a relationship with your users, and they would need to trust you as a company. And then you would need to get, high dimensional feedback and figure out how to use that, which in some sense might make it easier to model things. Like if you had this kind of strong feedback, maybe it's easier to predict what humans want. But in another sense, you have to first get a human to agree to trust you enough to do that. And I act kind of adversarially on social media. Like I know that linger time is like a metric that's tracked, right? Like even when you're scrolling. And so I actually purposefully scroll quite smoothly because it creeps me out. Like, also because I'm ashamed by the thing that I want to look at. So I don't really want that. So like, I do like tricks of like, if I read something and I'm like, oh, I want to hide that, I'll like just scroll really slow, like past the next few things, just right. And somehow like this is making the problem harder for the machine learning engineers. Like, and I could make it easier for them if I had a different relationship, but I don't, right?
Fine.
Thank you.
Very good. I think we're slowly coming to a close. If there are no more pressing questions from the audience, I think that's a very good note to end on. Bring it back to the humans. So I'd like to thank you all for being here and thank very much the panel for the discussion.